Hello, everyone. My name is Melissa Parsons, and I will be talking about my experiences in Japan and my research, which is adaptive redesign of lower limb exoskeletons using series elastic actuators. こんにちは、皆さん。私の名前はメリッサ・パーソンズです。私は5年生です。私の専攻は機械工学です。機械工学とあ比較文化学と日本語のマイナーです。私は九州大学に行きました。研究で Systems Engineering Lab ですね。でした。私の次回関係はロボットと宇宙です。In English, hi, my name is Melissa. I'm a fifth year at NAU. My majors are mechanical engineering and comparative cultural studies with a Japanese minor. And I studied at Kyushu University in Fukuoka, Japan. Within the systems engineering lab is where I did my research. And I have a huge interest in robots and space. So, like I said, I started within the systems engineering lab. And within the lab, there were actually three main projects going on at the same time. There was the lower limb and upper limb rehabilitation robots, and a microsurgery robot. Then the rehabilitation robots were supervised by Dr. Kazuko Kaguchi, and that's actually where I chose to be. Um, and I specifically chose this group because I think that biomechanical engineering is very, very useful. And since I have interests in space and robots, I would like to apply biomechanical engineering into those interests and hopefully get a future career from it. So I think it's very useful. But the main focus of the rehabilitation robots were to help those who were disabled or physically weakened to be able to get back to where they were mobility wise or be able to create a device to permanently help them in their day-to-day lives. And like I said, I think that's very, very useful when talking about space and granted robots in general. So within the two rehabilitation groups, everyone was mainly testing and researching different softwares and how they apply to the robots. There was very little hardware work going on. And by hardware, I mean mainly building, designing, reconstructing, that kind of thing. But when I got there, my professor, Dr. Kiguchi, basically told me to do whatever I wanted. I mean, I could join another student or I could do my own thing. It was entirely up to me. And I honestly didn't know what to do with that freedom. But I decided to redesign the lower limb exoskeleton, the entire thing. And this is actually a picture of it right over here. And I chose to do that because the lower limb exoskeleton has not been updated hardware wise in probably about 10 plus years. The motors were really, really outdated and it worked to a point, but it could definitely be better. So my research was basically to update all the old hardware, try to implement some new technologies, and maybe see what structural parts could be improved. And these are actually some of my early sketches for the robot itself and some redesigns. I was mainly going to change out motors for better ones, update sensors. I'm not even sure half the sensors worked on the actual exoskeleton. And I honestly wanted to fix the atrocious wire control problem that we had. There's quite a few things needed to just be cleaned up within it. And so that was going to be my research while I was there. And unfortunately, due to COVID, I couldn't really do anything with my research besides making sketches. I got the call on March 26th to come back to the US before the United States border closed. That was 6 days from the date that I got the call. It was so jarring and so sudden. It was really difficult to adapt to. I had to tell my dorm, my lab supervisor, City Hall, basically all of Japan, that I was leaving very, very soon and try to get all the paperwork in order to figure that out. This was hard not only emotionally, but also socially, as Japan is not a last minute country. Um, Even though everyone understood that this was a pandemic and that things were happening now and day by day, and no one knew what tomorrow was going to hold. Every supervisor that I talked to was so upset that I didn't give them more notice about it. Like, I had the instance of my dorm manager um, saying that even though, yes, it was a pandemic and things were happening so quickly, that I should have given them a month's notice that I was leaving the country, even though I got the call 6 days before I had to leave. It was really, really difficult and again, surreal to just drop everything and say goodbye to the community and my little family. And this is actually one of the last pictures I took while I was in Japan. It's out the plane window in Fukuoka, and it's two advertisements, one for milk and one for apple juice at the airport. So since I was home and I didn't have a robot to work on anymore, I actually had to shift my research to something that I discovered while I was in Japan. And that's called a series elastic actuator, or an SEA. And what it is it's basically a spring attached to a motor. And when the motor is running, it reduces knockback from it and it creates a smooth transition between going forward and reverse within the motor. Um, it's kind of an outside entity from the motor. And like I said, it's something that I thoroughly researched in Japan, and I was actually going to implement it while I was there. But again, I never got the chance to. So I decided to focus on using an SEA as a robotic knee joint and testing how it can be built within different limitations. And there are many, many different versions of an SEA. I decided to focus on the spring one, which this picture right here is a design of someone else's who has done kind of the same spring sort of idea. This one only includes one torsional spring though. And this CAD model at the bottom is actually my own personal design, where I was originally going to implement 4 different springs, torsional springs, and decided to stick with 2 of them in my final design. But that's one of my final CAD models that I had. And overall, I was just trying to test that an SEA could be built with limitations, meaning that it could be readily available and usable as a knee joint. And I was also testing the portability and overall functionality of the SEA as a robotic knee joint. And surprisingly, I was successful. This is actually one of the finished photos of the finished device. It's a little bit of an older photo, but there it is. So the main focus was to build the device with and see if it could be built within limitations. And the reason behind this, limitations wise, is that I was building this in the middle of a pandemic. I didn't have access to many resources. I would need to properly measure it and test it as precisely as it should have been. But it works with the general jerk reduction, its simplicity compared to other knee joints, and overall portability. The SEA is a solid candidate for a robotic knee joint. And obviously, it needs to be more fine-tuned and kind of more adjusted. But with the resources that I had available to me, I figured that this could be a solid conclusion. And over here in the bottom is a chart. It's called a QFD, which basically outlines some of the requirements that an SEA would need. And so I used that in kind of my final project to determine if an SEA could even be usable as a robotic knee joint. So, 皆さん、心配しないでください。後で英語を話します。でも今、日本語を話したいです。私は日本語で6月間、たくさん日本語と日本の文化を習いました。日本語の時は、サバイバルの日本語を学びました。完全じゃなかった。でも、たくさん人は私に分かりました。よかったですね。私は日本でたくさん新しいことがありました。後で豚になりました。本当によかった。たくさん人に会いました。そして私は彼らに手伝われました。 皆さん本当にありがとうございました。私は彼だっただから、あいい経験がありました。And returning to Japanese, or returning to English, excuse me, I had so many wonderful experiences while I was in Japan. I mean, not only was I a part of a Japanese lab and university, but also a part of the Japanese community. So this group of people right here are the people that I really became close to. They're my little family, and I actually met most of them while I was at Kyushu, and we became close through going to university together, going through college. Um, and it's always been said that in a foreign country, you bond with those who speak the same language as you. And while sometimes I think that may be true, I also disagree. I personally think that you bond with people more over interests than languages, more like experiences than languages. Um, and just like my friends Mo and Yukiko right over here, they were not only my roommates, but some very dear friends of mine. They spoke decent English, and my one roommate Yukiko actually spoke zero English. But we were still able to bond together and have these different experiences together. So this one right here is we were going to eat oysters right by the ocean, fresh oysters. And then this is Yukiko, another friend Arina, and then one of Yukiko's lab mates. So we actually got the opportunity to make fresh mochi on a little side show. And that right by the ocean. It was an incredible experience. And going along with these, I actually had a very, very unique experience surrounding Japanese tea ceremonies. So while I was at Kyushu, I took a history class about the history of Japanese tea ceremonies, and I just thought it was so fascinating. It was incredible, and this actually led me to be taking private tea lessons with a very small group of older Japanese women. And they were so very accepting of me and excited that I was in their class. This is the first time I had done anything like this. And they were so very patient with me. These little Japanese tea ladies were so very patient with my Japanese, because at the time it was not great. But they were absolutely fantastic and very accepting of me, which was very refreshing. And this bowl right over here is actually a bowl of my private collection, and this is one I actually used while I was practicing. And so this first picture right here of this building is actually of a tea hall in a Shinto shrine. And during that experience of attending a private tea ceremony there with many, many other people, we happened to run into a woman who knew quite a bit about kimonos. And so we were asking her about it. And she actually took us to a kimono shop. And that's what the second picture is, for me and my friend to pick out kimonos and have them fitted for us to actually go and wear them to our next public serving of tea. And that was such an incredibly unique experience to have this Japanese woman who spoke very, very little English to take us from a tea ceremony to a kimono shop and make sure we got the proper kimonos to wear for our next tea serving. It was incredible, but unfortunately, we had to miss that last public serving of tea to return to the U.S. And they did end up canceling it due to COVID. I found out later, but it was very disappointing. um, Overall, though, even though my time in Japan was incredibly short, it was wonderful. I wouldn't change anything about it, except, I mean, I would like to stay longer, but regardless, it was fantastic. And I would still love to go back to Japan for graduate school, and I plan on doing so. Um, Hopefully, I can continue my research within robotics and like space industry, and maybe I can even go back to Kyushu. But in general, I think going back to Japan is a must, and I am excited to return there. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you all for bearing with me and for listening. 皆さん、本当に本当にありがとうございました。またね。